It is indeed, and it truly is a distinct pleasure to be here with you this morning. And I know that I was going to make it work one way or the other to be here on this morning, as you guys are doing such significant work and really trailblazing, I think, in terms of the direction that we all have to go as a faith community. And it is certainly, you are ahead. Oh, my friend Susan, all the way down from Silver Spring, that you're certainly ahead of the curve in terms of the work that our presiding bishop, Bishop Curry, has made a priority for the Episcopal Church in terms of this matter of racial justice and what I call a just reconciliation as opposed to just reconciliation. And we'll talk about that, I hope, a little bit. It's so great to see friends and fellow clergy persons who are also friends, and I thank you, Reverend Angela Shepherd, for that moment of centering, because that was for me. I was lost in this city this morning. And I'm not very adept at technology and phone technology. I still think the only thing you should use a phone for is to talk on, and that the only phone you should talk on should be the one that's hanging up in your home. So following my phone directions, I know some, if there are any millennials around here, you don't remember hanging up on your wall at home. So I was lost. I said, Lord, just get me there before it's over. So I thank you, and I thank you for your patience. This morning, I want to speak for a brief time about this matter of Black lives, in this time of Black lives. And for those of you who have perhaps, and I thank you, read Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, some of this will be review. For you and for those, but I hope in a good way. And for those of you who have not, I hope to introduce you to the argument that I try to make in that text. And from there, talk a little bit about what that means for us as a faith community and as a church. So let me begin. Black Lives Matter. This was the hashtag, as many of you know, that Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tomette created as they say, a call to action for Black people after 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was posthumously placed on trial for his own murder, and the killer was not held accountable for the crime he committed, end quote. As the Black Lives Matter hashtag went viral across social media and eventually moved from social media to the streets, one thing became abundantly clear. It was about more than just a slogan. As theologian Paul Tillich says of symbols, it was indeed a symbol, for it unlocked the dimensions of the soul. In this instance, it unlocked dimensions of the Black soul in America. The Black Lives Matter hashtag unlocked the seething anguish that resides in the collective souls of Black women and men as they were once again confronted with the reality of how dangerous a world this was for their sons and daughters. For to be sure, after the July 13th, 2013 not guilty verdict of Trayvon's killer, Black people wondered if these United States of America would ever be a safe place for their children. When the judge read the verdict, Black America was once again confronted with the harsh reality that Black life in America was virtually unprotected, if not dispensable. The decision regarding Trayvon's killer was the 21st century version of the 1857 Dred Scott decision that at any given moment in time, Black people have, as it read, no rights that the white man is bound to respect. As hurt, disbelief, anger, frustration, and fear were profound within Black households, Black neighborhoods, Black barbershops, beauty parlors, Black churches, and the various gathering spaces of Black people in America, one question was being asked: if not directly, certainly indirectly. Do Black lives matter? It was a question I asked as a 6 or 7-year-old growing up in Dayton, Ohio. It was then that I heard the whispers of the adults around me talking about how awful it was that the Birmingham church was bombed and those 4 little girls were killed. I can remember hearing someone say that white man who did it will probably will never be caught. And if he were to be caught, nothing was likely to happen to him. Around that same time in my childhood, I remember seeing pictures on the news of white policemen with dogs attacking Black children. What struck me most were the dogs attacking Black children. I didn't know what I was watching then, but those images were seared into my mind, perhaps contributing to my profound fear of dogs today. I also remember eavesdropping as my parents talked about how a man in Mississippi who was killed in his driveway in front of his family, Medgar Evers. And what a shame it was. And again, I remember hearing them say how nothing would probably happen to whoever did it if they ever found him. It was no doubt these whispered conversations and these images of Black bodies falling prey to white violence that prompted me at the age of 6 or 7 to ask my father why white people didn't like us. What I didn't know then was that it was about more than whether or not white people liked us. The reality of this only became clear to me as I got older and after watching what happened to Trayvon. And then there was Jordan, then Renisha, then Jonathan, then Eric and Walter and Rakia and Michael and James and Tamir and Freddie and Sandra and Laquan and Alton and Philandro, and no doubt many more whose names have not entered public conversation or consciousness. And so it seems that the answer to the question concerning Black lives is being answered loud and clear. Black lives do not matter. Recognition of this fact is actually nothing new. Frederick Douglass came to the same conclusion some 180 years earlier when he wrote this. He said, "Killing a slave or any colored person is not treated as a crime, neither by the courts or the community," end quote. From the age of slavery to the era of a Black president, history seems to be repeating itself. Deadly violence continues to be visited upon Black lives with relative impunity. The question is why? At some point in the life of every Black woman and man, James Baldwin once wrote, they must face the shock that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance along with everybody else has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock, he continues, to discover that the country which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and identity has not, in the whole system of reality, evolved any place for you, end quote. There is no getting around it. The trajectory of history in this country has revealed in no uncertain terms that Black lives really do not matter. Faithful so gathered, there is trouble in our land. It is a trouble that goes far beyond racist policing, racial profiling, or even the bigoted insularity of a presidential candidate. Indeed, that any of these things exist and in fact are tolerated, if not justified in this country, suggests that there is something about America itself which devalues non-white lives in general, and most especially Black lives, thus compelling their denigration, if not destruction. And so we are right to not simply ask if Black lives matter, but to recognize, along with the Black Lives Matters movement, that they have not mattered, and thus, as this movement is attempting to do, we are compelled as a faith community to address the trouble in our land and to make Black lives matter. We must ask ourselves, what is our challenge? What is our call? Our call as a church, as a community of faith in this time of Black Lives Matter? What is our challenge? This, of course, brings me to the questions that I would like for us to think about a little bit on this morning. In order to answer these questions, however, we must ask the question of a 6 or 7-year-old little girl some 50 years ago. Why does it seem that white people don't like us? What is going on? Why is history repeating itself? How did we get to this particular Black Lives Matter moment? 50 years ago, in response to President Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "While the question who killed President Kennedy is important, the question what killed him is more important." Martin King's words are instructive in answering the question of why Black lives seem not to matter, for it is about more, as I said earlier, than bigoted police officers or bigoted watch captains. It is about more than who is putting our Black lives, especially our Black children's lives, at risk. It is about more than who is killing the Trayvons, the Renishas, the Sandras, the Freddys, the Philandros. In fact, we know the answer to this. We know who is killing them. Rather, it is about what is putting their lives at risk. What in this country is killing our children? While the answer to this question certainly involves the Stand Your Ground law, which was, as many of you know, a backdrop to the Trayvon Martin case and certainly influenced the thinking, if not provided the justification for the various other cases that followed Trayvon's murder, it goes beyond this law. The Stand Your Ground law, I will remind some of you and introduce to others of you, is an extension of English common law that gives a person the right to protect his or her castle. Stand Your Ground essentially broadens the notion of castle to include one's body. It permits certain individuals to protect their embodied castles whenever and wherever they feel threatened. In this regard, a person does not have to retreat from the place in which he or she is castled. They can stand their ground. Essentially, a person's body is his or her castle. Regardless of whether or not this law was used as a formal defense in the recent slayings of the various Black women and men, the Stand Your Ground law itself points to what is killing the Trayvons and the Renishas and the Freddys of our day. This law signals the mattering, if you will, of Black lives in America, as it reflects a culture that protects whiteness and vilifies Blackness. This culture flows from America's very defining narrative, a narrative of exceptionalism, which fundamentally, again, sanctions whiteness while it prohibits Blackness. Let me say something about this culture and this narrative. It's a narrative and a culture of sacred whiteness. The making of sacred whiteness in America begins with the arrival of the first Americans to this soil, Puritans and Pilgrims alike. In 98 CE, a Roman historian named Tacitus published what has been called one of the most dangerous books ever written, Germania. Perhaps it is. For in a brief space of 30 pages, he offered an ethnological perspective that would have tragic consequences for centuries to come. This perspective played a significant role, as a matter of fact, in the Nazis' monstrous regime for racial purity. It is the racial specter behind the Stand Your Ground culture that continues to take Black lives. For in Germania, follow me if you will, Tacitus provides a meticulous portrait of who he calls an aboriginal people, free, he says, from all taint of intermarriages. They are, he says, a distinct unmixed race, like none but themselves. He describes them with fierce blue eyes, red hair, and huge frames. Tacitus goes on to say that these aboriginal people possessed good moral habits, a peculiar respect for individual rights, and an almost instinctive love for freedom. Now, along with influencing the shape of various forms of government like America's democracy, Germania laid the foundation for the subjugation, if not elimination, of certain peoples. That is, those people not of the unmixed race that Tacitus describes. Essentially, Tacitus' ethnological description spawned the construction of the Anglo-Saxon myth. This myth has been a ubiquitous, even if unspoken and unacknowledged, ideology in the modern world. You all still with me? Now, initially, this myth highlighted Anglo-Saxon forms of governing and stressed, therefore, the unique superiority of Anglo-Saxon religious and political institutions. Eventually, and perhaps inevitably, the myth shifted its focus to Anglo-Saxon blood. In so doing, it suggested that the superiority of their institutions was as a result of their blood. It argued that strong moral qualities and high regard for freedom flowed uniquely through Anglo-Saxon veins. This myth, replete with reverence for Tacitus, arrived in America by way of England's post-Reformation struggles with the Pilgrims and Puritans as they fled from the Church of England to build a nation more befitting Anglo-Saxon virtue and freedom. These Puritans and Pilgrims considered themselves an Anglo-Saxon remnant continuing a divine mission. They traced their mission beyond the woods of Tacitus' Germans to the Bible. They saw themselves as the new Israelites in God's plan. A part of their mission, therefore, was not simply to build a nation in keeping with their Anglo-Saxon political heritage, that is, their love for freedom, but also to build a religious nation, a city on a hill, they called it, that reflected the morals and virtues of God, which, of course, were perfectly manifest in the virtues and morals of Tacitus' Anglo-Saxons. With this line of thinking, God is essentially imaged as an Anglo-Saxon, even as Anglo-Saxons are seen as the chosen ones of God carrying forth the divine mission. Thus, the Pilgrims and Puritans carried their Anglo-Saxon heritage across the Atlantic Ocean with a self-righteous pride, and they were clear about it. From its earliest beginnings, therefore, America's social political identity, with a legitimating religious canopy, was an Anglo-Saxon identity. Its sense of democracy and freedom was inextricably and explicitly linked to the Anglo-Saxon myth in Tacitus' Germans. This, by the way, was also a myth that greatly shaped the father of America's democracy, Thomas Jefferson himself. Thomas Jefferson was a thoroughgoing and unapologetic Anglo-Saxonist. He was resolute in his thinking that Americans were obligated to establish a form of government commensurate with their Anglo-Saxon past. Jefferson justified his high regard for Anglo-Saxon systems of government with another fundamental element of America's identity. He believed, like his Pilgrim and Puritan forebears, that Americans were chosen by God to implement an Anglo-Saxon system of governing. He too considered Americans the new Israelites, and he was not alone in his thinking. Founding fathers such as Benjamin Franklin believed the same. And I might add that they both believed that indeed it was Anglo-Saxons, not non-Anglo-Saxons, who could carry forth such a mission, and they were clear in their beliefs about the inequality and indeed perhaps even the inhumanity of black men and women. One only needs to read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia to know that. The point of the matter is that through architects such as Jefferson and Franklin, as well as the Pilgrim and Puritan founders, America's democracy was conceived as a divine calling. These founders legitimated America's Anglo-Saxon mission at the same time that they gave sacred validity to the Anglo-Saxon myth. As such, America was conceived as a testament to the sacredness of Anglo-Saxon character and values. The city on the hill that the early Americans were building was nothing less than a testament to Anglo-Saxon chauvinism. It is in this way that Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism is American exceptionalism. The grand narrative that defines America is that of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, and it is this narrative that demands a stand-your-ground culture in order to protect the sacred space of whiteness. The question is why? The answer is relatively simple. There is one problem with America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. You could guess the problem. Not everybody that looks like an Anglo-Saxon is actually Anglo-Saxon. Indeed, this has been the perpetual vexing problem for America from its very beginnings. It has been an immigrant nation with migrants, even migrants from Europe who were not Anglo-Saxon. Yet, there was a mitigating factor. At least those who came from Europe were white. And this made all the difference in the world. For not only did whiteness allow one to pass as an Anglo-Saxon, but it also signified that one was capable of assimilating to Anglo-Saxon ways and values. As various presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Coolidge and Wilson believed, whiteness became essentially the passport into the exceptional space that is American identity, as defined by the narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Entrance into this space is closely and grudgingly guarded by whiteness itself. Put simply, certain persons cannot pass the test. If certain persons cannot pass the test of whiteness, then there are certain spaces into which they cannot enter, certain rights that they cannot claim, hence an exceptionality that they cannot encroach upon. You got it? It is in this way that whiteness becomes the sacred property of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, against what legal scholar Cheryl Harris might call treasured property. Indeed, the construction of whiteness as sacred property is the advent of the ideology of white supremacy. According to this ideology, whiteness itself is a marker of a superior people, if not an exceptional people. As others have pointed out, the ideal of white supremacy becomes a religion of sorts. Deep faith is placed in it, as the supremacy of whiteness is that which provides the gateway to exceptionalism. In short, the grand narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism is the wizard behind the curtain of white supremacy. White supremacy, in fact, guarantees at least the illusion of Anglo-Saxon superior exceptionalism by keeping out those who are definitely not Anglo-Saxon. In the end, white supremacy may mystify its existence, but it is America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism that constructs and sustains the ideology of white supremacy. Again, whiteness is sacred property. Just as whiteness protects America's exceptional identity, the narrative of exceptionalism shelters whiteness. And as I mentioned earlier, it does so by according to whiteness certain rights that are not granted to those who are not white. These rights, such as the right to free space and the right to exclude, again, serve to fortify whiteness as the barrier between America's exceptional space and those who most threaten it. Hence, a stand your ground culture is born. For whiteness is given the right to stand its ground against anything by any means necessary that might encroach upon the space of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Put simply, stand your ground culture emerged part and parcel with the ideology of white supremacy, and as such is the culture that concretizes the meaning of sacred whiteness. Just again, inasmuch as Anglo-Saxons are viewed as the chosen of God, then whiteness itself becomes a marker of that divine chosenness. And so from its beginnings, Pilgrim and Puritan beginnings, the grand narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism has shaped America's identity, thus producing a stand-your-ground culture to protect the sanctity of whiteness, which now leads us to the vilification of blackness. It's one thing for whiteness to be sacred. It's another thing in that construct for blackness to be vilified. The black body has become trapped in this web of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, this web of white supremacy, this web of stand-your-ground culture. For it is a web that ultimately constructs the black body as a criminal body, always, always guilty of something. Let me just look very briefly at this and how this is the case. How did it become the case that the black body is seen today as always guilty of something? This is a story that goes back to slavery. For we must understand that the black body as chattel is the specter from slavery that has the greatest impact upon black people's current social, cultural, political realities. It was firmly established, this construct, within America's collective consciousness during slavery, and it remains a pervasive part of America's consciousness today. This construct is a valuable part of America's exceptionalist identity. Thus, it is not easily disposed of. As author of The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, has aptly pointed out, racism, she says, and she's right, is highly adaptable. And I add, so too are the constructs that have fostered it. They just take different forms, those that are appropriate to the social historical context of their day. It is what one legal scholar has called preservation through transformation. Oftentimes, the transformations effectively mask the racialized character of the new construct. Such is the transformation of the black body as chattel to the black body as criminal. The 21st century version of this chattel construct is indeed the criminal black body. Be clear that the black body that was once marked as chattel is now marked, as if it is the case, as criminal. This construct serves the same purposes as the construct of chattel. It relegates the black body to an unfree space, thereby preserving the free space as the white space. When did this transformation begin? It began shortly after emancipation. During this period, black people began to enjoy some of the rights that were considered quote unquote, wages, as W.E.B. Du Bois has called them, wages of whiteness. However, the image of the black person as chattel still lurked in the imagination of American society. The fear of black people that consumed white people after emancipation was driven by the belief that black people no longer saw themselves, if they ever did, as chattel. There was an urgency, therefore, to reinscribe black people with the identity as chattel, hence to return them to the space for which they had allegedly been created. It is, of course, not by chance that stand your ground culture, which was fostered to protect the white space, began to assert itself in a most aggressive manner right after emancipation. Why? Because this was the first time that white America had to deal with a population of free black bodies. The assertion of stand your ground culture effectively removed the black body from the white space by criminalizing it. How? Through the various assertions of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction stand your ground culture, such as black codes, Jim Crow laws, and lynching, served to transform the construction of chattel into criminal. For the various black codes and Jim Crow laws in particular served to plant the image of the black body as a criminal body deep within America's collective consciousness. Because essentially, these legal productions, these laws, were, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, they were designed, quote unquote, to fit the Negro's condition, and he said to be enforced particularly with regard to the Negroes. These laws literally made a criminal of black people as they ensnared them in a criminal cycle. Essentially, these laws penalized black people for living while black by placing them in jail or relegating them to forced labor. How'd they do that? They made illegal the very conditions of black living. That is, not having a stable job or an income or being a vagrant. Now, what enslaved person right after emancipation had a stable job, had a home, and was not a vagrant? It is in this way that blackness itself became a marker for criminality, right? The black body was effectively criminalized for simply living and being black. And like chattel, a criminal does not belong in free space. The construct of chattel was seamlessly transformed into a criminal construct. The construct of the criminal body now has been sustained in the 20th and 21st century the same way it was sustained in post-emancipation America. How? Through the racially biased laws of stand your ground culture. What laws are those? The drug laws, the stop and frisk laws, and of course, stand your ground law itself. Michelle Alexander has called the prison industrial complex the new Jim Crow. She is right. Again, that it does, as she says, function as a well-designed system of racialized social control in a manner similarly striking to Jim Crow. The laws that have been generated to ensure a majority black imprisoned population certainly are updated versions of Jim Crow laws. Nevertheless, the prison industrial complex is about more than the Jim Crow laws that make it work. This complex attempts to reinstall in a more acceptable 21st system manner the same system that Jim Crow was developed to reinstate: slavery. The prison industrial complex returns the black body back to its proper place. It virtually re-enslaves the black body by putting it behind bars. If the black criminal is the new chattel, then I declare the industrial prison complex is the new slavocracy. The industrial prison complex is the institutional manifestation of stand your ground culture. With jails and prisons serving as the new plantation, cherished white property is protected, and the most dangerous black body of all, that is the black male body, is adequately patrolled. What makes the transformation complete is the insinuation of the image of the black body as criminal into the American collective consciousness. Therefore, the black body and the criminal body become virtually synonymous. To see a black male body, almost unwittingly for some, is to see a criminal body. And thus, it was impossible for the white police officer in Cleveland to see 12-year-old Tamar Rice as the 12-year-old child that he was. He saw a threatening criminal man. It's interesting to also note, every time you hear, if someone will ask, why did you shoot him? Why did you do that? And the officer oftentimes says, I don't know. That's what it means. That's what it means to have the insinuation in our collective consciousness of the image of the black body as a criminal body, so a part of our unwitting collective consciousness. It is also interesting to note, by the way, in relationship to the Tamar Rice case, that in Ohio, there's an open carry law, meaning it's legal to carry a gun in public. I'm from Ohio, I know. So, even if the officer thought Tamir was 21, then he had a right to carry a gun. What is clear, however, is that the right to carry a gun, concealed or not, is a right accorded only to white bodies, and certainly not criminal black bodies. It is a wage of whiteness. It should also be noted that the black female body has been criminalized as well, perhaps in a more gender-specific way. She is often portrayed as criminally immoral and most times mean and angry. It seems to me, right?
Come on, preach, girl.
Don't give me... Episcopalians, don't preach like that. It seems to me that it was no accident that the image of a black woman that continuously looped through the media during the Baltimore uprising 2 years ago was of an angry black mother going after her son. To be sure, the image of the angry, if not somewhat dysfunctional female-headed black household was perpetuated in the continuous looping of that black mother. And the Moynihan Report of the 1960s was once again upheld and once again seared into the public consciousness of the angry black woman who heads a dysfunctional black household. It is no wonder then that when one sees a black female like a Sandra Bland, she automatically looks threatening. The transformation from chattel to criminal is complete. The free black body is viewed as a clear and present danger to cherished white property. It is a body that needs to be kept from roaming freely about society. It needs to be controlled. This is a criminal body, and indeed, it is guilty of something. In fact, according to the web of discourse and knowledge spun by America's grand narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, those free black bodies are guilty of something. They are guilty of trespassing into the free white space. There is simply, unfortunately, no getting around it. The myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism has shaped and continues to shape America's sense of self. It is in the very DNA of this country. Though sometimes unspoken, and I emphasize sometimes, given the political rhetoric of today, here, make America great again. Did I say that? This narrative, and it's not a laughing matter, is a pervasive narrative that determines who is and who is not entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and therefore who has the right to cross boundaries and borders, to claim land and to stake out space and to literally stand his or her ground, or to have ground to stand upon, for that matter. As Pulitzer and Nobel Prize winning novelist Toni Morrison has pointed out, she says, deep within the word America is its association with race. To appreciate this fact is to understand why, in the era of a Black president, stand your ground culture has intensified, putting young Black lives in a heightened sense of danger. For a Black man has entered a space that was never, ever intended for Black bodies, the white space that is the White House. So whiteness is standing its ground in every which way it can. So the matter of Black lives now becomes a little clearer. Inasmuch as they are seen as a threat to the treasured property that is whiteness, they are expendable. Otherwise, they are to be maintained and controlled in such a way that they do not interfere with the myth of Anglo-Saxon superiority in this nation. In other words, as long as Black people are trapped in crippling conditions that circumscribe their life options, limit their opportunities to achieve and fulfill their God-given potential, and indeed trapped in conditions of living that will ensure their mediocrity or failure, while white bodies are granted the privileges that foster their achievement and success, as long as these opposing white and Black realities exist, then the myth of Anglo-Saxon superiority is maintained. And so it is, given the persistent and pervasive reality of stand your ground culture in this country, Black lives do not matter, especially when they are seen as a threat to the rights of whiteness. It should also be noted that it was inevitable, therefore, that as the Black Lives Matter hashtag went viral, whiteness would stand its ground with the refrain, all lives matter. And so what does this mean for us? As I bring this to a close, as a faith community, as a church, let me just suggest a couple of things that will hopefully lead to our further conversation. The fundamental call of the church is one in which we are reminded of in our services every Sunday, as it is the center and focus of Episcopal worship, the Eucharist. During what has become known as the Last Supper, Jesus said, "You do this in remembrance of me." We are instructed by the Greek word for remembrance used in this text. This word is amnesis. This particular word means more than simply a mental recollection of events. It suggests an embodied kind of recall. It means to bring the past into the present through one's own embodied actions. Amnesis is perhaps best understood as the reenactment of past events. During the Last Supper, Jesus was calling his disciples to remember him through their bodies. That is, to act in their present as he had acted. As the body of Jesus, that is church, we are to remember him by acting and doing as he would in the world. This means nothing less than conducting, defining, and being accountable, conducting ourselves and being accountable to the very people to whom Jesus was accountable, even unto the cross. And who are those people? They are the crucified class among us. Those that are seen as a threat to the status quo, those who have been abandoned to death, those who can't defend themselves against the crucifying realities of our world. In this instance, the Black lives that do not matter. And so it is, we must not be a part of the crucifying realities that threaten the lives of especially our Black children. We must not be with the crucifying crowds who say, crucify them, crucify them. We as a faith community must indeed be on the forefront of stopping such crucifying violence. This is the violence, for instance, of poverty. A poverty in which Black children are 4 times more likely as white or Asian children, and significantly more likely than their Latina or Latino counterparts to be trapped. This is the crucifying violence of inadequate schools, in which 1/4 of the high schools with majority brown and black children do not offer Algebra 2. Again, 1/3 of those schools do not offer chemistry. This is the crucifying violence of a school-to-prison pipeline, which begins with black boys being 3 times more likely and black girls 6 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended from school, and where black students make up approximately 16% of the public school population, yet account for 31% of all school arrests. It is the crucifying violence of a juvenile justice system where black youth are twice as likely as white youth to be arrested, and where black youth make up only 14% of all youth, yet 40% of those incarcerated. This is the violence of extreme poverty neighborhoods that have doubled since 2000, and in which, again, 1 in 4 of the black poor as opposed to 1 in 4 of the white poor, 1 in 13 rather, of white poor live. These various manifestations of racialized, systemic, and structural violence reflect the violence that far too many of our children quietly fall prey to. That is, quietly without media attention and without public outrage. Furthermore, this is the crucifying violence that precipitates the violence which spills out onto our streets, which the media does report, and which does occasion public cries of "stop the violence." Yet, to stop this violence requires that we pay attention to and stop the systemic and structural violence that is a daily, everyday threat to black lives. This is the crucifying violence that is injustice. The point of the matter is this: far, far, far too many black children have been abandoned to living conditions that foster their death, not their life. They are essentially trapped in conclaves of crucifying death. They are trapped in crucifying realities of living. They are trapped in the very violence of injustice that nobody speaks about. They are trapped in the injustice of racism. Church, we must be clear that God's peace is God's justice. No peace when there's no justice. It is for the peace of God, therefore, that we must work. Even when the violence that goes on every day in our neighborhoods in terms of the inadequate schooling and the poverty, even when nobody else is talking about it, we must act to stop the violence. We must act, and we must not be amongst the crucifying crowd. And we are that when we remain silent. It is our prophetic responsibility as a faith community to call out that violence. And then there is a pastoral responsibility. This responsibility begins in this instance with recognizing that the problem of racism in America is not simply a black problem. Indeed, as my talk has suggested, it is profoundly a white problem. But here is the thing. Black parents, black churches, and congregations are consistently engaging in conversations about race and racism. Why? Because it is necessary for our survival as a people. I often wonder, however, what kind of conversations are white parents and white churches having with their children, with their people, with their congregations about race and racism. Change starts from below. It starts with telling the truth about ourselves, about others. It starts with having these hard conversations about that which divides us one from another. It starts with the hard conversations about racism. Our churches must lead the way in those conversations. There is no getting around it. That is our pastoral responsibility.
Let me end with this. What are we to do as a faith and church community? Put simply, we must refuse to be consoled until this world is safe for all of our children. And thus we must absolutely refuse to be consoled until we can all say that Black lives do in fact matter. It will be then that God's justice will be done, and that the crucifying realities of violence that is racism have been overcome.